The physiological piece around perfectionism is an interesting one. We don't think about it that way. When we think about perfectionism, you might have the idea of an Olympic athlete, the best basketball player in the world. The old version of me would have been too scared about what others would think about the, quote, Harvard-trained cardiologist talking about the critical value of a mindfulness practice, of a meditative practice, of an active, deep rest practice, of focusing as much on our patient's social connection as we do on their blood pressure, if not more. These would be considered very weird ideas.
Welcome to Success Reimagined. I am Dr. Amna Shabbir, your host on this journey to thrive at the intersection of ambition and wellness. In every episode, I'll help you challenge outdated definitions of success, discover practical tools and strategies for growth without compromising your well-being. I am so glad you've joined me. Let's reimagine what's possible together. Dr. Jonathan Fisher is a Harvard-trained cardiologist, author, and organizational well-being leader with 25 plus years of clinical practice and 50,000 patient encounters. His book, Just One Heart, winner of the IBPA Benjamin Franklin Award and endorsed by U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Richard Carmona, explores the 4 dimensions of heart health. He co-founded the Ending Clinician Burnout Global Summit, convening 1,000 plus clinicians from 43 countries, and created the Heart-Mind Connection Framework at the intersection of cardiology, contemplative science, and leadership. He co-hosts the Fixing Healthcare podcast and writes for 4,000 Substack subscribers. I'm one of them. He is a LinkedIn healthcare top voice and has been recognized as faculty at international medical gatherings across 3 continents. Welcome, Dr. Fisher.
Hey, it's so good to be with you. Finally, I'm excited to have a conversation.
Absolutely. I've been following your work on LinkedIn. I have been such a fan of your messages, so I'm really excited to dig in today. You have worked at the intersection of cardiology, leadership, and human performance when you look at high achievers and how they're struggling today. What stands out to you most about how they're living and working?
So much of what I know about high performers and the struggles they have came from my own experience. I certainly didn't start as a high school student reading about high performance. I simply tried to follow in my brothers and sisters' footsteps. I have a big family. There's 7 children, and my dad was the town doctor. And one after another, all of my brothers and sisters followed my father's footsteps and became physicians. And so there was an incredible pressure to achieve, to succeed, and to perform at the top of our games in order to get to that next level. And there certainly was a lot of pressure to be perfect, which had a tremendous impact on me, good and bad, I would say. And so what drove me was the inner drive to succeed. And I still feel that. And yet, over many years, that drive, which got me so far, also created a tremendous amount of inner conflict, of pain, of loneliness, of confusion, of frustration, and ultimately to anxiety and depression where I needed treatment.
I just want to hold space for a second and appreciate and thank you for sharing that, because we don't see our leaders, especially leaders in medicine, say those statements and that they too are human and they too are fallible, and you're openly sharing the mental health struggles that you went through.
Part of why I do what I do and why I speak where I speak is to share as an example that may give someone else permission to ask for help, to feel like there's not something wrong with them, that they're not broken. I didn't have examples like that when I was going through medical school and residency when the struggles really began. And I certainly didn't have them in the first 10 years of my career. It wasn't until 17 where the first New England Journal article was written on burnout by Dr. Victor Zhao, talking about the crisis of burnout in healthcare. Before that, it had been simply a research interest, academic interest over in California. And so part of the value of this work is just for that one physician, that one APP, that one nurse who thinks there's something wrong with them, to hear somebody who looks like they have it all together. They have all these accolades and all these credentials and all these fancy institutions, is just a human being who has suffered for a long time without letting other people see that, at least not on the surface. What I realize now is that it should have been obvious to anyone around me that there was something that was disconnected on the inside.
Can you share a little bit more about that last statement that you made about others potentially having, knowing that there's something going on?
Hmm. So the challenge in healthcare and in high stakes environments, high pressure environments, in fact, in our whole world right now, is that our natural compassion, which helps us be attuned to the suffering of others, where we might notice a micro expression of sadness on the face, where we might hear that somebody's tone of voice doesn't match what they're saying. Because of our own pressure to succeed and perform and balance a chaotic life, many of us have lost even the ability to do what's most human. And that became amplified during my medical training, especially as I worked to be at Mount Sinai and then to be accepted into Harvard. I think a lot of us were so busy posturing and pretending to be something we thought that everyone expected of us that we were playing this bizarre, almost dance or act where we all had these masks on, kind of like shadows on a stage, acting the part of the high achieving physician, when in reality, I think if I could go back and speak to my colleagues, I would have discovered that a lot of them were struggling in the same ways. And we were so focused on our own inner turmoil that we were not able to focus outward.
I feel like you're talking about me and my colleagues right now as well. Like when we were going through our bunch of like medical training and the way you were talking, you use the word posturing and that is and shadows on the stage. Like that is a powerful visual. I was going to ask this later, but I feel like it's appropriate for me to jump in and ask this right now. In this struggle and masking and posturing, how would you say perfectionism showed up for you?
I only heard about the term perfectionism in the last 5 years or so. I certainly, looking back, can see that my understanding of how one becomes successful in the world came and was shaped by my parents. And I took on some messages from their behavior that they weren't intending to send. And the message was, if you're going to do something, you can't make any mistakes. I saw my father as the town doctor who was widely respected, who was incredibly confident in his abilities, and he didn't publicize what may have been considered a mistake. My mother also showed up with tremendous courage and confidence. She never talked about any insecurities that she had. And so I assumed, right or wrong, that that meant that I was broken because I felt very insecure. I felt like I was pretending. And in order to maintain that, I had to be perfect. I couldn't make any mistakes. And then, with that philosophy, which I took on without being aware of it, it turns out that it's not a bad habit to have if you want to perform and succeed by external metrics. All of our school systems reward perfectionism because perfectionism is conscientiousness, but taken too far. So there's nothing wrong with being conscientious, of being self-aware, of trying to do our best to get a little bit better every day while accepting ourselves as we are in this moment. That's the missing piece. And so it's really only in the last 10 years as I've come from this place of deep inner criticism while holding this persona, this mask of outer perfection, that gap became too painful to continue to hold, too exhausting to continue to hold. And I could feel that exhaustion that I, at some point, decided to live an imperfect life and to not only accept my imperfections, but not even call them that. Because in calling them imperfections, it even suggests that there is such a thing as perfection and just instead allowing myself to be a human being.
That last point really like resonates with me when you say that. When we even call them imperfections, and that's why I would insert air quotes right there, these are our perceived imperfections. To be human is to be fallible. I appreciate you sharing that. As we, I'm going to ask you to tie that, if it's tied or not tied, the role of this really performative based identity, like performance based identity, where you're absolutely right. The external metrics of success are vastly different from what our internal compass might be calling us for. Did they play a role in the anxiety or depression that you experienced, in your opinion, not the studies, because the studies show us all kinds of things?
Yeah. In my experience, one of my strengths leading to academic success and professional success was extreme conscientiousness and tendency towards perfectionism. There's no denying that. But at the same time, I absolutely hold that that same strength led to anxiety and eventually led to depressions. There's absolutely a direct connection. The mechanisms are interesting, and there are many mechanisms. The most obvious is that if you're holding yourself to a standard that you can never meet by definition, because once you've succeeded or achieved what you think is perfection, the goalposts are moving, there's another metric that you have to meet. It's a never ending and it's a losing game. It's a lifelong losing game. And once we accept the rules of that losing game, it activates our fight or flight nervous system. We're constantly threatened by that idea of failure because the opposite of perfection is not subtle imperfection, it's failure. And that's how most people interpret it. And so it's natural to understand how this imperfection taken, this idea, this impossible standard will lead to anxiety. And now certainly we can acknowledge the difference between anxiety and depression. There's tremendous overlap, but there's also each one has its distinct qualities. For me, anxiety was this constant worry that something bad was going to happen. I was going to make a mistake. Something bad was going to happen to me, to somebody I was caring for, and that life itself, I was anxious what was coming next. Whereas depression felt a lot more like a darkening, a narrowing, a heavying. I'm going to make up a word, a heavying, where that lightness that I had when I was a little kid and I used to play and people loved me for my sense of humor and lightness was just gone. And I didn't want to do things that I enjoyed because I actually didn't experience much joy for a period there. And I think the goal of being perfect, it was such a heavy weight to carry for so long that it led into both of those.
The way that you've described those emotions is so vivid, and you're right, it's a losing game. And what I'm gathering from your experience and explanation is almost this very visceral, physiological level of reaction that's happening to perfectionism in all of these different directions.
The physiological piece around perfectionism is an interesting one. We don't think about it that way. When we think about perfectionism, you might have the idea of an Olympic athlete, the best basketball player in the world, and you see them consistently hitting the three-pointer and you say, wow, they're perfect. It's amazing. What you don't see, and now this is up until a few years ago with some prominent athletes coming onto television and saying, I need to have a mental health break. This doesn't feel right. I can't sustain this. That's a recent phenomenon. And so I think we're seeing this cultural shift where those of us who are performing at the highest levels, whether it's in sports or in healthcare, are getting real about the fact that it may look perfect on the outside, but it's the farthest thing from it.
Absolutely love that example, because what came to my mind was the way Alyssa Liu handled the Olympics. I mean, I watched that round so many times. It was the expression of joy, and like her openly sharing how she had taken a pause and then gone back into figure skating. And I mean, I can do an entire episode just on that. So I appreciate you bringing it in. I want to spotlight the amazing framework that you've developed, the heart mind connection framework. How do you define it, and what does it reveal about the way we experience stress, performance, and health?
When I started to try to make sense of why I was struggling so much with anxiety and with burnout, even as a cardiologist who seemed to have it together, and why my patients were struggling with cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, heart attacks, maladaptive eating, lack of sleep because of stress, I knew that there was something here connecting our thoughts, our beliefs about ourselves and the world, our behaviors, and our physical sensations and our health outcomes. And as I started to explore, of course, I went back 100 years to, at least in Western science, to the Dr. Cannon, who talked about fight or flight and everything that came after the discovery of the placebo effect with Beecher in World War II, looking at the impact of saline placebo instead of morphine, helping relieve pain. And I became fascinated with what effect do our beliefs have on our physical health? Now, it's a little more obvious, what effect our beliefs have, whether we're optimistic or pessimistic, whether we're neurotic worriers or whether we're confident, courageous, risk takers. It's obvious how that'll make us feel, but it's less obvious the physical health outcomes. And I saw in a lot of my patients that many of them were coming in sick, even though they were eating a healthy diet, even though they were exercising, sometimes obsessively. And some
Mm.
of them were dying young of heart disease. And it opened up this conversation with the past about what did we humans once know that we don't know anymore about how to stay healthy and how to stay happy. And it led me to this most obvious connection, which is between our brain, or as I like to call it, our mind, because our mind is not our brain. Our mind is something much bigger, and our heart. And the initial the initial conversation was around how do what the activities in our mind affect our physical health. But what I discovered, and what many of us now know, is that it's not one direction. There's a two directional conversation that's happening between our heart and our mind, even during this conversation. As you're having thoughts about what I'm saying, as I'm reacting emotionally to what you're saying, my heart physiology is changing. It may be beating a little faster, a little bit stronger. My blood vessels may constrict or relax. And then there's a feedback loop back to my brain, which is creating a state of awareness, a state of receptivity, and a state of connectivity, which will then determine what I say and how you respond to me, which, as you can see now, we're getting into this bidirectional feedback loop. We have this conversation between our own heart, our own mind, and those that are around us. And it's really helped simplify for me how to just be happier, in a sense, to pay attention to the physical heart, but also the emotional heart, also the social heart, also the spiritual heart, and simply understanding how all those four dimensions are connected.
Sounded extremely expansive and holistic and validating in a way that you explain. You said that you don't like to use the word just the brain. You like to use the word mind. Can you expand that a little bit more for the audience?
My medical school textbook had many pages written about the brain, and I spent 3 months at Mount Sinai Hospital studying neuroanatomy and dissecting the brain and learning every pathway. I can't recall any discussion of the mind. So for me, the brain was introduced as 2 pounds of flesh that sit inside a bony skull and everything that it's capable of, a machine. As I had to find my way out from the darkest places in order to continue to see 3,000 patients every year and pretend like everything was okay on the inside when it wasn't, in order for me to do that, I had to access parts of myself where the pain was hiding. And it was initially seemed to be just in my thoughts because I could see the worries. I could see the sad thoughts. But what I realized, this was through exploring Eastern traditions, exploring meditation, mindfulness, yoga, tai chi, qigong, forest bathing. All of these practices are simply about deprioritizing activities of the brain and amplifying the signals that are coming from the body that we have had to dismiss. We have had to silence in order to keep functioning, at least in our Western success model, at the highest levels. And so when I think about the difference between the brain and the mind, the brain is the flesh, the mechanism. The mind is not limited to the brain. The mind is simply that human resource. You can't call it an organ. You maybe can call it a system, a functional system that involves every single cell in the body, because we now know that every cell has some form of feedback to our consciousness, our overall self-awareness that helps us perceive the world and make decisions about it. So not to get too abstract here, but that's how I think about the difference between the brain and the mind. And for me, the heart is very much part of what many would call mental activity, without most people being aware.
I'm smiling as you speak because I am reminded of the time where I started my own healing journey, and people would use words like this, and my extremely, what I would say, overdrive cognitive physician brain that was also extremely crisp with burnout, riddled with moral injury, felt like these conversations were inaccessible. And actually, if I would even engage or indulge myself in conversations while I culturally come from a culture that is in the East, if I allow myself to, yeah, I would say indulge in these kinds of healing conversations, something would happen. Like somebody would go and actually take out my medical license and my degrees and rip them apart. So you are a Harvard trained cardiologist. How are you talking about this? What made you think it is okay to explore, not just explore, but actually bring this to the forefront of the work that you do?
What made me begin to talk about these things is different than what allowed me to begin to talk about these things. And before I can answer what made me talk about these non-traditional, out there, some would call weird topics, at least 15 years ago, the old version of me would not have been able to have this kind of a conversation. The old version of me would have been too scared about what others would think about the quote Harvard trained cardiologist talking about the critical value of a mindfulness practice, of a meditative practice, of an active, deep rest practice, of focusing as much on our patient's social connection as we do on their blood pressure, if not more. These would be considered very weird ideas 5, 10, 15 years ago, and in many cases today. So, what allows me to do this is a change that happened inside me where I decided to stop living my life worrying about what other people think about me. There's no way that you and I would be having this conversation otherwise, or that I would write a book talking about the role of ancient and Eastern and wisdom traditions and philosophies and psychology in the body's health. Now, once I came to a place where internally I'm allowed to show up and to have the boldness and the courage that that insecure little boy didn't have years ago because he was worried about being judged, now the question is, what made me do it? And what made me explore these areas was that the current approach that I had access to wasn't working. The approach of just going to work, of just coming home, of maybe just seeing a therapist or just taking a medication for depression. Yeah, that helped some, but it still left me burned out, not understanding why I was struggling in a healthcare system that I thought was mine to inherit. And fortunately, I had access to Google. This is 20 years ago. And I Googled the search as a good researcher does, a scientist, as someone who values his own curiosity as one of my greatest strengths. I typed in the question, how can I ever be happy again? And I went down the rabbit hole and I discovered there's the field called positive psychology. So I bought every book there was. I researched and I found every teacher I could. And then one of them mentioned that one of the 11 practices of a happy person is something called mindfulness. So, well, what is mindfulness about? So I bought, and this is back before we had, we had to buy CDs in order to get, recordings. So I had CDs of mindfulness. And that led me to the next 15 years of deep contemplative experience where I've been on retreats. I've spent a week in silence at a Zen monastery with monks, all around, and gone over to Oxford in the UK so that I can become certified to help others use these very simple practices, overcoming some of what's weighing them down. And as I've tried to dovetail my own inner quest with my professional life, I began speaking about this. From my earliest days in 2012, 14 years ago, I gave a medical grand rounds called Mindfulness and the Heart. This is back when people weren't talking about mindfulness so much. And in terms of the heart, there was emerging research. And so I've been following that and I've been involved in that, so that in 2017, I was happy that the American Heart Association released a statement, a white paper on the role of mindfulness in cardiovascular protection and disease. So that's also part of my mission, is to broaden the way that we think about cardiovascular health in general.
I'm so glad that you did this work and we can actually talk about this today. And when we're talking about things like mindfulness, these experiences, it's hard to quantify them. And I'm reminded that you wrote one of your Substack articles, or maybe it was a LinkedIn post. I really felt so seen that day. And it was about constantly optimizing for everything. Like everything has to be optimized. We have to have numbers and metrics. As I'm doing work surrounding organizational well being, everything needs to be able to be plugged into some sort of number, metric, or spreadsheet. While I love those, and it's great to have a before and an after, and you can quantify things. What are your thoughts? You are so experienced when it comes to living our lives through this extreme hyper and analyzed, overanalyzed experience, whether it's wearables or you're tracking HRV, you're tracking other metrics.
Yeah. I think that what prompted me to write that newsletter was I got an advertisement directed at me to buy some device because if I didn't start measuring my HRV, I wouldn't be as healthy as I could be. And it rubbed me the wrong way. And the other reason I wrote that is because I've got lots of patients all along the spectrum of health and disease, of wealth to poverty, of people who have the means and access to the best foods and the best resources, and those that have no means at all. And at one end of that spectrum, people often come to me saying, well, Dr. Fisher, which HRV tracker should I get? And I get messages in my inbox that take a lot of time. And they say, okay, you didn't ask for this, but I've been tracking my HRV every day for the last 2 years. And you have to explain why it decreased by 2 points between these 2 months. And at some point, I had to ask the question, what are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to achieve? And I think a lot of it can be helpful, and a lot of it is a distraction. It's a distraction from a more effective approach to health. And I think there's two conversations. One is around this idea of optimization, and we can have a philosophical conversation. I have thoughts on optimization. I think that it's not properly balanced with what I'll call and someone else may call satisfaction, not satisfaction, but satisfaction, which is where we decide that we're going to be satisfied rather than always trying to optimize. And we can do both at the same time. As far as these HRV trackers, someone can Google and can read the article that I wrote. But basically, why are we obsessed with these types of measurements? Certainly in healthcare, they can predict longevity, and they do. But when I find people focusing so much on numbers, I can almost always find that they're missing something else. And instead of focusing on an external metric, they may do well to spend a little more time on developing a bodily awareness and an intuition and a trust that when their body needs rest, they don't need a device to tell them that. If they would slow down long enough, if they would reject the cultural message that rest is for lazy people and there's something wrong with you and you can't be a high achiever, and if you would embrace the opposite message, which comes again from Olympic athletes, which is not only is rest not bad for you, but the best athletes have regular rest programmed into their schedules. So, of course, these devices are not going anywhere. I look at my own heart rate variability as I'm doing endurance training and other sports out of curiosity. I still know how my body feels. And another separate angle, and then we can talk more or less, is this interesting role that HRV plays in serving as an indicator of emotional and cognitive flexibility. This has come into certain workplaces. One of the leads, I won't name, but a very big consulting company in the US reached out to me and asked me about what I thought about the role of having their employees track their heart rate variability as a surrogate measure of their emotional well-being and burnout. And there have been some research trials in healthcare as well using external metrics of burnout. Why? Because we are so busy that we can't even tune in to our body's inner messages. And even though once we do, we don't have the permission to honor them. And once we do, we're so afraid for rejection and losing our jobs that the system continues to work us as if we don't need any rest. So the bottom line is that HRV is a very powerful metric of cardiovascular fitness, of emotional flexibility. It can be very useful. And it also, like so many technologies, can be taken and focused on as a proxy in place of things that would have a deeper, more lasting impact.
So many thoughts right now. My brain is going in multiple different directions, and I'm going to try and keep it on track by, first of all, you use the word wisdom, inner wisdom, intuition, and then first you're reconnecting and actually honoring those messages. Very much so. I have seen this in my personal journey as well as the other humans that I've had the privilege and honor of helping. It shows up. The mind body disconnect is so vast, and yes, the irony is not lost on me, and I feel like there's so much of it is also driven by perfectionism. And then when you throw this entire layer of trying to use this as an organizational well-being tool, like I just have so many thoughts surrounding that. But I would love to ask you in this moment how you take the amazing framework that you've created and then plug it in as you are leading organizations through well-being. You're manning a big ship. So how do you make this applicable?
There's two of me and there's one of me. I mean, there's one guy here who's trying to make sense of this one life that I'm lucky to have, and I'm married. I've got three teenage kids. I try to take care of myself. I've got a big family, and I've decided that I'm not going to fall back into my old ways, which is to give my whole life over to work because it looks good and because it feels validating and because it makes me feel worthy. And in my own research, over time, I put together everything I've learned in what you called frameworks. And there's a couple different frameworks, but I think the most useful one, and the one that emerged from 1 year of research and 60 hours of interviews, was this idea of if you want to be happy, if you want to be healthy, and you want to create systems where people feel the same, we have to take a holistic approach. We can't in healthcare just focus on the body, which is what has happened over the last 100 years. The body has been reduced to this box of joints and muscles and nerves. And if there's a quote problem, we'll just focus on that problem. That doesn't work. We have to look at the systems that the body is working in and the systems and governments that those are working in. And so the simplest framework for me is that the heart has 4 dimensions to it. And if we can keep track of these 4 dimensions, we can be well and we can be happy. And the first is the physical. So we need a foundation, whether you call it lifestyle medicine, preventative medicine, where we sleep well, we eat well, we are active and we rest. There's the emotional, where we all have to learn the basics of emotional intelligence. And we have to act intelligently emotionally. We have to honor people's feelings. We have to bring them into the workplace. Because if we don't, and we think that we're compartmentalizing them, well, we often never come back to them until they bubble up and show up in ways where we wonder, why did we just do that? Why did we just say that? Because we're generally not very good at honoring the role of the emotional heart. The third is the social heart. It's that, why do we use a heart emoji? Because the heart has always been a symbol of our social connection. And when we look at modern science, we see that it's not just a symbol. That when you and I are in deep conversation, when we're in the moment, where we're in flow, our hearts begin to synchronize. Our heart rates slow down. Our heart rate variabilities increase. Our respiratory rates tend to synchronize as well. There's this mammalian mimetic effect that tends to happen. And Siegel, who I interviewed for the book, developed a field called interpersonal neurobiology. And I'm just expanding that to look at interpersonal neurocardiology, how our cardiovascular state has a direct impact on the people that we're around, whether we're leaders or whether we're not. And I believe we're all leaders in a way because we're setting it some form of an example. And then the fourth dimension of the heart is the spiritual dimension. And before people get upset, it's not religion. Spirituality refers to the spirit, spirare, to breathe. It's just the breath of life. It's that feeling of vitality that we have. That if you are working through burnout, if you're working through anxiety, through depression, if you're not sure what's missing, it's usually that. It's usually that your spark, your spirit, your sense of self, your sense of purpose and meaning in the world, it's missing. You've been disconnected from it. So for me, that's the 4 dimensions that I bring to my own life as a check, as like a, how can I check in today, in this moment, right now? Am I caring for each dimension? And when I work in organizations, I can help leaders look at these 4 dimensions and what does it mean to make sure that your employees are connected with their purpose and meaning? Oh, by the way, did you realize that employees who are connected with their purpose and meaning have less cardiovascular disease, which means less healthcare spending? Now we become interested. So part of the message that I bring with as a cardiologist and as a scientist, and especially in the book begins with, I have something to prove. And what I set out to prove by giving an overwhelming, hundreds of current citations, is that these four dimensions are not metaphors for the heart. They literally each have a direct impact on our cardiovascular health.
Such a breath of fresh air. And I feel that recently in my life, I have been so aware of the passing of time. And this one day going into the next, I feel maybe I have finally reached that stage of my career, and it seems to just be going so fast. And I look at my daughters and I feel that. And so, as you bring in all those beautiful elements of well being together, that interconnectedness that I feel, I want to take all of that and use those as daily checkpoints. What a powerful way to bring in so much science for the people that really need to look at the numbers. I invite everyone to read Dr. Fisher's book, bringing in all of those beautiful elements together and then adding them into our daily life.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. And since you mentioned time, I'm going to share with you something. You may see it in the background. There's an hourglass there. And in case you can't see that, I also keep one on my desk. And there's a very specific reason why I keep an hourglass on my desk. And the Stoic philosophers knew that. And they knew that they had this idea called memento mori. And not to be morbid here, but this idea that just remember, we may kid ourselves into the fact that because of all these longevity hacks, we're going to live together. Just give that up for a moment and realize we're all coming to the same end here. How are we spending our time today? And in addition, I've been obsessed with the idea of time because when I started meditating 15, 20 years ago, I started to experience time in a very different way. I realized that when we sit still and we take our mind off of deadlines and worries and past and future, we have the present moment and we realize that time is completely artificial. I know this is going to sound weird, but Einstein described this. Depending on how fast we're traveling, our perception of time changes. So what happens when we slow down? Time expands. It's called time dilation. And so one of the frameworks that I've introduced now for 5 years ago within my own system and outside is called TIME, TIME. And this is a 6-month course where every month I get online with 300 to 400 doctors and nurses and leaders throughout the organization. And we simply talk about how do we create more time in a system that's moving faster and faster. And it's an acronym. And there's another separate course called SPACE because we need more space in our lives. And that's another 6-month course. And to honor my mother's favorite scientist, Albert Einstein, this course is called, it's the Space-Time Continuum, and it's a way to live in the present moment, happier and also healthier. One being the pillars of mindfulness, what I've learned as a meditation teacher, and the other being the pillars of positive psychology, what I've learned as a psychocardiologist.
I like that term psychocardiologist, and thank you for sharing those with us, both of those frameworks in which you're like looking at this extremely in a very holistic way. So for our audience members, there's a lot of high achievers that are tuned in, and some of them are still going to struggle with the way you've given them permission to rest. You're giving them permission to slow down, which is a lot what we need, right? We need that permission, but are we going to receive that is a whole different conversation. If you were to strip away all this noise that the wellness culture is producing for somebody on a very individual level, we have touched on so many points today that are wonderful. If we have left out anything and you wanted to please add those for prioritizing our and sustaining both our heart health and our overall well-being and performance, what would you add to that?
At the very foundation for people who are still struggling, even though they feel like they're trying everything, to reminder that you have a choice. You always have a choice. And we can trap ourselves into never experiencing the life that we would rather be living when we put a limit or a belief that it just has to be this way, that I've got no choice. There's no other way. And that can lead us into very dark places when we have that belief. And so I would kindly and generously offer to our colleagues that where you think that there may be no choice, it calls for creativity and courage. And sometimes that means taking a stand for yourself. Sometimes it means changing the system you work in. Sometimes it means not doing it alone. It means reaching out and finding co-conspirators in changing the system. And sometimes it means giving yourself to permission to leave a system that has tried to break you. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. You're not a quitter. You're not a failure. And I would begin there before optimizing everything else in just examining what are your beliefs about what's possible in your own life? How good can it be?
Your reminder of autonomy and choice, it falls really well with the way I approach things as well. I mean, a lot of times we will look, it's kind of like refusing to look at the elephant in the room and dancing around it when we're looking at all these smaller hacks and things that you're going to get these short hits of dopamine from all these, I would say, wrong places where you're actually missing that big elephant that's sitting smack in the middle of the room. And it's reminding me of the self-determination theory, the SDT doesn't sound nice when you say it as an SDT, but, the part of the competence, autonomy, and relatedness, and autonomy being a really big part of it. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you. SDT was an interesting area, and some very good books on ending burnout in healthcare have been written strictly using that particular framework from the 1970s. And I personally found that very rewarding. And in this concept of personal choice, it's certainly not mine and it's not SDT's. It probably goes back even before the Stoics. And that was the first principle of ancient Stoicism, which is in everything that happens in your life, the first step is to figure out what do you have control over and what's beyond your control. And I think that's where so many of us get lost in spending so much time and energy and emotion on things in our immediate sphere and things in the world at large that we may want to influence and we may find a way to influence, but in our current state, it'd be much better to just focus on the things that we can control, which begin with our inner state. How are we speaking to ourselves? How are we loving and showing up for the people that are most important to us?
So powerful, and I completely agree. And I think that there is a journey that has to happen for us to recognize that, because we are in systems that make us feel so disempowered that we forget that we did actually have choice at some point, whether it is even operating within the rigid frameworks of perfectionism or medicine, or that just surviving the next shift and it's Groundhog Day again, and you forget, oh, I do have choice somewhere in the middle. So I appreciate you highlighting that. This podcast, we have a lot of conversations surrounding perfectionism, and the title is Success Reimagined. And I would love to hear how you have, after spending years of your life through this deeply rich journey, whether it's personal or professional, reimagined success for yourself.
Success. What does success mean? I never thought about that question in an intentional way. I lived the first half of my life on a railroad track with a train that just kept getting faster and faster. And I could feel the wind in my hair and it felt good at times. But I didn't realize is that someone else was driving the train, and that someone else were my parents, were my teachers, were the people I was trying to look good in front of, were the medical schools who either would have me or not have me, and then the residency that would match me or not match me. And then this, what I thought was societal validation of we love our doctors, we respect them, we care for them. And that certainly has changed over time. Since then, I've reimagined success because that vision of success, where if I would just work harder, if I would just be a little more perfect and look good, then I will have everything that I'm supposed to have. That was a lie. In fact, it led me, that particular framework, that formula for success led me towards anxiety, towards depression, towards burnout, towards loneliness, towards hopelessness. And as I picked myself up, I had to literally throw out that model and reject it outright. I knew that it wasn't going to ever lead me to happiness. And so I decided, and it's a very simple approach, that I will define what success means for me. And you could call this mental gymnastics. You might even call it self-delusion, but I think we're all living in some form of delusion, and that what we think we're perceiving with our eyes and our ears, we're not actually perceiving. There's even a millisecond time delay, and what we think is the now that we're seeing in front of us actually happened a fraction of a second ago, and yet we create a story. So that's a conversation for another day. But once we can strip away this illusion and delusion of our consciousness, why not allow ourselves to define success for ourselves? So I have decided that life is going to be a game for me, and I am going to make rules where I win. Not that other people lose, and not that I beat other people, but simply rather than having to achieve anything, how can I be successful in this moment, during this conversation right now? How can I view my whole life as a success? Well, if that's the game that I want to play, then I have a lot of work to do. I have to start looking at the shame that I carry for the things that I did wrong. I have to start practicing forgiveness for myself and for other people. I have to start making peace where there was no peace in my life. And once I can do those things, then I start to taste success. And it's always available.
I'm supposed to ask another question, but I'm just trying to soak in your answer from the last one. That was a very powerful answer and definitely a unique one whenever I ask somebody how they have reimagined success for themselves. So I appreciate you sharing that. Dr. Fisher, this has been such a delight. I want my audience to connect with you, follow you on all those spaces and places, subscribe to your Substack, buy your book. How can we do all of those amazing things?
If you Google Just One Heart, that's my message. That's my philosophy. You'll find my book on Amazon and Audible and other places. If you want to read more, you can find me on Substack, where I have a newsletter, which I just love creating, exploring this mind-heart connection that I think is the answer to so much of the disconnection we have. And you can find me on LinkedIn, where I'm most active. And I'm frequently just posting whatever comes to my mind there. And then, of course, I have a website with my name where organizations who want to have me join them for some fun and interesting workshops and retreats can find me there.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. This has really been a pleasure. And thanks for all the great work that you're doing and for your voice.
You might believe you don't have the time or energy to focus on yourself, but this is exactly the right time to get serious about your well-being. You don't have to do it all alone. I'm here to help. If you enjoyed this video and are ready to take the next step, head over to dramnashabir.com, where you'll find free resources you can access right away. The website link is below. Let's get started on your path to thriving.